We acknowledge the lands of the traditional custodians across Australia. We recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples' continuing connection to land, water and sky country. We acknowledge the wine regions and hundreds of different nations around this continent, and the ancient soils on which we stand and grow. From the Wadani salt bush peoples of Margaret River in our west, to the East Coast Sunrise people of the Yuin Nation, and the Southern Island and Saltbush peoples of the Nione peoples of Tasmania. Today and always, we pay our deep respects to the custodians, those who went before and those who will follow, as the knowledge holders of tomorrow. This is Australia.
The wine producers of the Mornington Peninsula acknowledge the Bunyurong and Boomerang people who have been the custodians of this land for many thousands of years, and we pay our respects to their elders, past and present. We acknowledge that the land on which we live, work and create is the place of age-old ceremonies, celebrations, initiation and renewal, and the Bunurong people's living culture continues to have a unique role in the life of this region.
Good morning, everyone, and good evening to our 6 wine growers in the Mornington Peninsula. This is a really exciting session. We've got 6 fantastic Pinot Noirs, and we've got their respective winemakers here present. So I'll just begin by introducing them. So first of all, we're going from left to right on our screens, and I'll make them bigger so you can see them. We've got Tim Perrin of Kooyong. Hi, Tim. Then we've got Mike Aylward, Ocean 8.
G'day.
Peter Dillon, Handpicked.
Morning.
And we've got Rollo Crittenden of Crittenden Wines. And then Lindsay McCall of Paringa. And finally, Martin Spedding of 10 Minutes by Tractor. Hi, guys. Really good to be here. And I guess for you, you're in the middle of vintage. Yeah, so that's quite a big effort to turn out on a Thursday evening. So first of all, let's have a little bit of context. Pinot Noir in Australia, very interesting story, but it's really quite recent story. If you look online and you Google, you'll see most people say that Pinot Noir came over with Busby's importations in the 1830s. Well, actually, that's not true. There's a really good book that I'd like to plug, which is The Australian Ark by Andrew Kayard. It's a big 3-volume work, history of Australian wine, just a remarkable piece of scholarship. And Andrew gave a talk at the Pinot Massive in November in Victoria, and he talked about the history of Pinot Noir in Australia. And actually, it looks like it was brought over in the first fleet in the late 1780s, and then it was known as a little or small black cluster. And so Pinot Noir has been in Australia right from the very beginning of viticulture. But it's kind of not really had a star role until maybe the 70s and 80s when it started getting interesting. Although some of the famous Maurice O'Shea wines had a big dollop of Pinot in them. It's only really with the revival of the Yarra Valley in the late 1960s and then Mornington Peninsula, which kind of got going for real in the 1980s, although with some plantings in 1972, that Pinot's made a bit of an impact in Australia. Now it's a very exciting category, I think. But what about Mornington Peninsula as a place? Well, I should really ask you guys about this. So Martin, tell us about the Mornington Peninsula. What makes it special and what makes it so suitable for Pinot Noir?
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. And hi, everybody. Great to be able to do this. Look, I think Mornington is a very special part of Australia. It's obviously right at the very bottom of mainland Australia. It's got the Southern Ocean on one side, Bass Strait. We're surrounded by water with Port Phillip Bay and the Western Port, so a very heavy sort of maritime climate. For a very small region, it's got an incredibly diverse landscape, and that difference in altitude, in aspect, the influence of the water bodies that sit around the peninsula really create an incredibly rich tapestry of terroir, which obviously from a Pinot perspective and Chardonnay, but particularly as we're talking Pinot, is fantastic because obviously it's such it reflects those little nuances incredibly well. So yes, I think what we've learned over time is that Pinot Noir really flourishes here, and some of the early vignerons who planted a whole range of different varieties quickly worked out that this is one of those special parts of the world where Pinot really flourishes.
So anyone who's kind of read a bit about Mornington and the different areas will have heard of these terms up the hill and down the hill. Tim, what do these terms up the hill and down the hill mean?
Exactly what they mean. So basically, our elevation is not huge, but there is a significant hill. Red Hill is the hill we speak of, and Main and Ridge. They're the two main grape growing areas that we refer to as up the hill. And then everything else down back towards Melbourne is as we sort of come down the hill, lower elevation is down the hill. The soils up in Red Hill and Main Ridge they're more red volcanic from extinct volcanoes, where they become more sort of sedimentary loams as we come back down the hill towards the more northern parts of the peninsula. And
in that you can actually have quite a significant difference in picking dates as well with that up and down, can't you?
Not this year, but it's generally it's a lot cooler up the hill, and it can be sort of a week, 10 days, sometimes 14 days in cooler seasons between picking dates for the same variety.
And can you taste the difference in the wines, Mike?
Oh, definitely. So I think with Mornington there's very few places in the world where you can grow Pinot, so we're very lucky to be able to grow it, or it's very difficult to grow. But Mornington's very temperamental, and there's a lot of undulation, there's a lot of different soil profiles, so we're still prospecting, trying to find the best sites within Mornington for the best Pinot Noir vineyards and also the different clones and whatnot to plant. So we're all we all collaborate together, but we're all trying to find those best sites. But I think when you look at the last 20 years, you can definitely see certain consistencies with different sites and different characters coming out of those different sites, which is really, I think, what people look for when they're drinking Pinot Noir and what they want to see.
And Lindsay, do you get much vintage variation in Mornington?
There is some, yes, from in particular seasons when. Because we talk up the hill and down the hill, as has already been mentioned. The down the hill producers pick earlier because they're warmer and they ripen earlier. And in some seasons, they might get the advantage of a particular season, and the up the hill may, in a cooler season, may have more difficulty in ripening. The reverse can also happen. Down the hill in warm seasons or hot seasons may be affected by the heat more than up the hill. And so the degree or two difference in temperature can benefit the vineyards that are up the hill. So, and no one vintage is the same, but we see these sort of patterns emerge over time.
Yeah, and Rollo, what about yield differences from vintage to vintage? I remember coming out in 2017. I was around there in February, and it looked like these. I was going around the vineyards, and there was these tiny little clusters. It looked like it was like just like it looked like a very low yielding year, but I'm presuming that's not typical of every vintage.
Well, if you look at the last 5 years, it certainly seems to be typical. We've had a string of extremely low yielding harvests. But yes, I mean, there certainly is yield fluctuations. We tend to, that there is variances between sites with relation to yields, but we tend to move en masse in terms of the region with all suffering if it's a low yield, it's a low yielding year. But having said that, we certainly don't want to have an excessive crop. I mean, as everyone probably knows, if you exceed certain crop levels with Pinot Noir, you start to dilute flavours and concentration. So certainly as a group of producers, we don't want to have an excess of crop by any means. And if we do find that there is a heavy yield, we will go and fruit thin just to try and control that and keep the concentration in the wines.
And when we talk Pinot Noir in Australia, there's always a strong emphasis or a strong focus on clonal material. Is this the case in Mornington? Do we have a lot of clonal discussions there? And what sort of clones seem to do best? Peter, we haven't heard from you yet, so.
I mean, something like the MV6 clone is always a strong base in any region, and it's had a very long history in a traditional sense on the Australian stage. But I think Mornington is probably similar to any region that really is driven by that passionate focus on the nuances and the scope for what you can do with Pinot Noir and the different clones. So there's an immense diversity of clones here, and some of them are actually probably in some ways like some of the material that Martin's got. It would be in many ways unique to Australia, some of the first material planted. So I think, it's always a feature, because I think Pinot Noir winemakers love those little tweaks and variations of character and expression that come with that variation of clone, and some can be incredibly deep and powerful and rich, and others can be beautifully fragrant and perfumed and delicate.
Martin, what's this material that Peter's referring to?
Oh, I think Pete's referring to a Calera clone, which we've planted out part of our high density vineyard with, which comes from Josh Jensen's vineyard over in California, which originally is one of the suitcase clones where he jumped the wall at Romney Conti, and he planted his whole vineyard based on that. But I think that was just another experiment for us to see how that does in our conditions. What we know about clones, different clones of Pinot is they're very how they perform is very site specific. We get a rough idea of how they might perform, say, in the Mornington Peninsula, but what works well on one of our vineyards may not work well on another. But we have those sort of mainstays. I think we're sort of 20, 25, 30 years into those discussions. We've got a lot more choices today than what we used to have. And I think we've really settled on a really wonderful group of Pinot clones that give us exactly what Peter was talking about, that one diversity of styles and most importantly, that give great expression to the site.
It probably overlaps his comments too about up the hill and down the hill or vintage variation that we see. And I think in many ways having that mix of clones and that expression is a useful thing as a producer, because some are going to perform particularly well in a warmer year and they might actually look quite different in a cooler year and vice versa. So that really gives us that fantastic sort of tapestry to then work with when we have that variation in seasons and etc.
Is anyone planting on their own roots, or is everything grafted in the peninsula?
The early days we all planted on own roots, but in the last probably 15 or 20 years, since phylloxera moved closer to Mornington down to the Yarra Valley, we're all planting on rootstock now, and we're phylloxera free and on the Mornington Peninsula, and we've been tested only 2 or 3 years ago, and we were tested for 3 years in a row, and they weren't able to find it. But we know well that it could be or will be coming at some point.
So when people come to visit the vineyards, if they've been in other vineyards in other regions, do you get them to kind of wash their boots or change their shoes?
With the number of tourists we have coming, Jamie, that's a pretty hard thing to do. No, but we try to discourage them going into the vineyards. That's for sure.
Yeah. It's are there any old vineyards in the peninsula? And what are the oldest vines, Pinot vines?
Well, we were just talking about that before this started, actually. You're talking about one of the vineyards, which is down in the lower part of the peninsula, which was planted back in the 70s, and I think some plantings that even go back before that, actually. But you're sort of looking probably 1970s. In terms of the 21st century, you're sort of talking in the 1970s. So we're obviously plantings here going back into the 19th century, but in some of these similar areas.
Yeah, I think if you look at sort of current plantings that still exist, you'd look at the Meyer family with LG Park, had probably one of the earlier plantings, who obviously famous through the chain store, of the Meyer chain store. And more recently than that, but in the late 70s, was Main Ridge Estate. Matt White was probably one of the first sort of small commercial producers who had Pinot Noir, and it was certainly the earlier. And Estonia soon.
Well, I read that when Gary Crittenden planted 5 acres one weekend in 1982, he doubled the vineyard area in the whole of the Mornington Peninsula. So that's
I think, that reflects how boutique the region really was in the early 80s and late 70s. It was a pretty quick flourish of plantings after that, I'd say.
It'd be quite interesting to go to one of the older vineyards and do a little mass selection. If the fruit's good, if those vines are performing well, doing a little bit mass selection, because whatever clone they were put in 40 years ago, is it 40 years ago? Yeah. There might have been some sort of like mutations, whatever. You might have some, it's not fully, truly clonal now. And it'd be quite interesting to do a little mass selection of some of those old vines. Because I know in California, I was chatting to...
we could go to Burgundy.
Some of the people in doing selections of clones, so they're doing clonal selection or mass selection from clonal material, and then using that next generation of clonal material to produce vineyards, which I think is quite interesting, because in Europe they just talk about this all the time, the mass selection. They don't really talk about clones so much.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
I think that's an interesting point, Jamie, in that while we do put a big focus on clonal material, certainly as the vine age does begin to kick in, you do, those characters take on a life of their own, while we have 7 clones of Pinot in our vineyard, we have a more of a focus on the older plantings than the younger, newer sort of selected clones these days. Seem to be the better performing or the higher quality fruit for us.
Yeah.
And just in terms of some figures for the benefit of people who want to write all this up, the last figures I found was there's around 950 hectares in Mornington Peninsula at the moment. Is that still accurate? And of those, half is Pinot Noir, which makes it an unusually Pinot Noir focused wine region, with the next biggest variety, Chardonnay, at around quarter of the plantings, and 200 vineyards. So it's all small scale, and around 50 cellar doors. So no big companies involved. This is kind of boutique winemaking territory, presumably. That seems to be the picture, which I think is quite an interesting one. And
I think the growers down here too know their sites really well. They've been growing on their sites for sort of 20 years, and they know how to get the best out of their sites. I think that's really important with Pinot. So definitely the people sitting around this table, they've selected their sites very carefully, and then they've worked them, they've chosen their clones, they've made some good decisions. But definitely working that site for a number of years helps you get the better quality Pinot too.
Yeah, and Jamie, there's been quite a few plantings in recent time too that have gone in, which I think has also been great. You've seen over the last few years quite a lot of new plantings going in on new sites, and I suppose as we were talking about earlier, as Mike mentioned, as we're learning more and more about just the sites that are working really well down here.
So I've got a couple of questions in the Q&A before we're going to get to the wine soon. So don't panic, everyone. We're going to get to the wine. But question from Simon Woods: how much difference does aspect make?
Well, aspect, I'll just start it off if you like. I mean, the aspect can make quite a lot of difference. This part of Australia, because we're so far south, the hottest part of the day here can be sort of between sort of 4 and 6 o'clock at night this time of year. Unlike, for people who might know Sydney, say, might be the hottest part of the day, will be 1 or 2 o'clock during the day. So a westerly facing aspect will pick up much more of that late afternoon heat load and maybe the hotter part of the day, whereas an easterly facing vineyard will pick up that morning sun. so get a very different sort of exposure. But we definitely see a lot of variation based on aspect.
I think too, I mean, that's for me, one of the exciting aspects of, well, that's the wrong word, one of the exciting things about Mornington Peninsula is here we have a region of 1,000 hectares, but there's this incredible diversity, and because of the that degraded volcanic sort of structure that exists and then embeds itself in the country around that, as producers, we can actually almost dial up what we want in terms of aspects. So depending what we're seeking, to the south we have the Antarctica landmass and these prevailing winds that are incredibly cold. Historically, probably those southern slopes were untenable in terms of sites that could be considered, but now, over time, they're something that can be considered. If you look at that altitude overlay with that, we then have this incredible complexity to the landscape because, at sea level, or the lower vineyards are probably 20 metres, 25 metres, and we come right up to the top of what used to be the volcano, and we're at 325 metres. For every 100 metres gain in altitude, you're dropping a degree in temperature. It just gives us this incredible diversity and complexity too, where we really can drill into those really quite microscopic microclimates and find this amazing diversity in terms of the wine styles that result from that.
And we've got another question from Nicole Wolbers about what's the average yield over the last few years for Pinot?
I think the average yields, well, as a region, it would be, we probably, it's hard, we don't talk so much in hectolitres per hectare, we talk in tonnes per acre. So you can do your conversions, but we've probably been averaging as a region about 1 tonne per acre, which is extremely low. Probably not
that's
even
2.5 tonnes a hectare, yeah?
Yeah, that would be roughly, yes. Yeah.
That's low.
To that point, though, I mean, that's a reflection of what we've had is this weather system called the La Nina weather system. And I'm sure that's going to be talked about as we taste these wines. But what La Nina is particularly bad for is really unsettled weather at the point of flowering. So we can have everything set up perfectly in a viticultural sense, but if you have this bad weather at flowering, that's really makes life incredibly difficult. We're behind the 8 ball at that point. And that's really been probably the biggest impact in terms of those overall yields for the last 4 or 5 years.
So, Jamie, as you wrote in your book about your examples of disruptive weather systems and climate change affecting all parts of the world, we had disruptive weather in 2002, let's say 14, and then we've just been through 4-5 years in a row because of that La Nina pattern, which has continued to repeat itself. Unprecedented in the 40 years and unprecedented as far as we're aware. But that's been very disruptive. Hopefully we've broken out of that now. We'll get back to more normal sort of long-term averages, which we would hope would be more around that sort of 2 tonnes or 2 tonnes to the acre or 5 tonnes to the hectare. That would be sort of what we would hope you would be averaging across our vineyards.
It's probably worth clarifying, though, Jamie, that poor weather system does only tend to affect the flowering and not the subsequent quality. So it reduces the quantity due to poor fruit set. But then, ironically, we've had these beautiful summers, by and large, which have resulted in a very low yield but extremely high quality of fruit. So, keeps the consumers happy, but probably not so much the bank managers. So, we could tolerate a little more fruit on them.
I think we should start with the wines because this is what we're here for. And so we're going to kick off with Kooyong with Tim. Tim, so as you introduce the wine, introduce Kooyong and
sure.
Then we can taste along. And also the good thing is you're all sitting together, so you can try the wines of each other, which is kind of fun as well. Maybe logistically during this it might be too complicated, but certainly afterwards you can give each other a little critique, maybe, a taste off. You should do a blind taste off, and the winner should, buy dinner or something.
Thanks, Jamie. So obviously, I would just give you guys a brief rundown of Kooyong as a producer. we are probably one of the larger estates for the region. The Kooyong vineyard itself is 40 hectares of vines at the moment. It wasn't originally that large, but there's been some subsequent plantings go in. But it's predominantly Pinot Noir. The first vines were planted in the mid-90s, 1996, by Mike's family, actually. So there's a fair bit of history with the site, but also being such a large vineyard, we've got actually quite a good diversity in soil type, clonal material, planting density, clonal makeup. So we can always tailor the estate wine to, I guess, make the best reflection of what we think Kooyong should be, irrespective of the vintage conditions. So I guess the wine itself, we have our Kooyong Estate Pinot, which is and I want the estate wine to always be a true estate. So there's 4 subsequent plantings of Pinot on the property. Our Haven, Ferris, Mears, and Norwood block. They make up the single block wines, which are at the top of our tree. And this one sort of sits just above. But I want to see in this wine, I guess, all elements of the sites and the little sort of microclimates that we've got within such a large vineyard. So there's a fair bit of the north block in this wine. The soils are pretty heavy, a little bit heavier up there. It's a higher density planting, but there's also some other parts out of Mears, which gives us a bit of fruit lift, and Ferris and Haven, which also gives us a fair bit of body. The 2023 vintage is probably a great segue of what the guys have just said. It was a La Nina season, very impacted by flowering. Some of our blocks at Kooyong were less than a tonne a hectare, which is probably not worth picking at that point, but we persevered. There was constant rain pressure throughout the growing season. However, harvest, it was clear for the first, I guess, 2 months, which allowed us to sort of pick everything in the optimum ripeness. The flavours were so concentrated due to the low crops. The acids were vibrant and persistent. And in the Kooyong Pinot, it's always got this dark cherry flavour. That's its core fruit element. There's always like a slight citrus twist. If you sort of imagine like a mandarin peel kind of Campari kind of note. There's also a fair bit of earthiness in there, being down the hill. And I use a small amount of whole bunch in this wine, about 12%, just to give it a sort of a green spice element as well, to try and sort of, I guess, marry together all the flavours to make something that's fruity, elegant, and yet savoury.
So no Pinot discussion would be complete without mention of whole bunch. So you say 12%. So when you say 12%, do you put a little bit in all the tanks, or do you do 12%?
The good thing about having such a large vineyard is it allows me to do a lot of, I guess, experimentation on certain things. We've got ferments that are going at the moment that are 100%. We've got ones that are 40, 50, down to 10, 12. And it just gives us all the blending elements that we need. But for most of these parcels, I sort of sit somewhere between 10 and 15. I just think that's the right amount for the fruit. I mean, whole bunch, it's a very winemaker zeitgeist, personal preference kind of thing. But for me, it's whole bunch is just an element of a wine. And like all good wines, it's about balance. No one element should be dominating. So whether that be the oak, the tannin, the fruit, whatever, it's all about balance. And I want it there to be obvious whole bunch, but it shouldn't dominate the wine.
I think this wine's beautiful. It's got this delicacy and perfume, but it's not lacking flavour. It's just it's almost transparent. There's a really nice flow across the palate, good acidity, truly elegant wine, lovely wine. And what oak regime do you have? Do you do everything in small barrels?
So I mean, again, we're fortunate being a large wine. We've got all the tools in the shed, but I like barriques and puncheons, which is 228 litre and a 500 litre. And again, I give certain blocks the smaller wood, other blocks the bigger wood. But again, it's about balance. I want oak just to be. I want it to be the picture frame that the vineyard sits in. You should just be able to see it, but not dominating.
And in terms of aging, this is delicious now, but is this a wine you'd cellar?
Yeah, I mean, the great thing about Mornington Pinots in general is the tannin profile. If you think about acids, what gives white wines its ageability, tannin does the same for red wine. So I think, and the great thing about all Mornington Pinots, not just the Kooyong wine, is that they do have a persistent line of fine tannin, and that does set it, to ageability. We're fortunate at Kooyong that we've got, a museum of, wines dating back 25 years, and, even some of the earlier Pinots under screw cap are drinking very well at the moment. So,
fantastic. So second wine, Mike, Ocean 8.
Yeah, sure. Well, our sort of history is when I was a kid, sort of 8 to 10 years old, we'd come down to the peninsula a lot, and Mum and Dad loved their wines, and they loved their Pinots. But I remember they'd always buy Paringa, so they'd be buying Paringa, Crittenden, Murdoch. So all the sort of people that came and started the region and started the setup and discovered that Pinot could be produced. And then around the later 90s, quite a few more people came down, and there was a lot more plantings around the late 90s. And that's when my father decided to get into the business down here. They bought a site up in Red Hills, probably one of the coolest sites on the peninsula, and it had a little vineyard on it. It had 3 acres of Chardonnay. And anyway, my parents planted that out to Pinot Noir and found that the site was almost too cool to ripen Pinot Noir. So they got some good consultancy, and they went looking for a better site to produce really high quality Pinot and Chardonnay. And that's where they found the Kooyong site. And so we had really good fun planting that out and trying to make some amazing wines off that. And then in 2004, we'd set up a beautiful winery there. It was a state-of-the-art winery. And then we were doing some contract winemaking and bottling. And then the owners of Port Phillip, the Georgia family, came in and they bought the business off my parents, which I was pretty disappointed because I was working in the business and I loved it. So that was, sort of took a step back and thought, what do I do now? But we wanted to stay in the wine business. And we had this really cool site that wasn't quite suitable for Pinot Noir. So then we went and found another site, which was planted by Red Hill Estate back in the day. They planted about 120 acres. So it was another one of those big plantings. There were some great clones that went in, but really good aspect, which we were talking about, really good soil profiles. So we started producing on that site. We've only got 7 hectares of Pinot, so it's tiny. Our total production is about 6,000 to 7,000 dozen, so we're not a very big producer. But we do try and do fairly interesting styles, I think, for the peninsula. I always loved the cooler sites on the peninsula with the really elegant, Pinots. And the site that we had was on the warmer side, but I've always tried to make very elegant Pinots off that site. So sort of what Tim was getting at, don't want anything super obvious in the wines, but I want the site to come through. But I think with that, the 23 Pinot that you're trying there, it's a very sort of Mornington Pinot. I'd like to think if someone bought that wine, they'd be buying it because it's got very Mornington characters in there.
Very bright.
Very bright.
Yeah.
Beautiful wine. Again, there's substance there, but then a really nice transparency to it. It's silky, it's elegant, but it's fresh. Really, really impressed with that. And does that have any whole cluster in, or is that all destemmed?
There's no whole bunch, but I don't take it off the leaves until bottling, so it sort of it ages on pretty heavy leaves, so it gets some spicy characters. But I really like the perfume in that wine. I think that's what Mornington does well. We do beautiful perfumes, and that shows a lot of that fragrance. And I think that leaves just helps give it a bit more spice. I've tried some whole bunch off that site, and I find our site's a bit too sappy for it. It doesn't enhance the wine. It sort of it doesn't work with that site.
Yeah, beautiful expression. Really love that wine. You make quite a lot of Chardonnay as well, yeah?
Yeah, we do. We do a very Chablis style of Chardonnay, very clean and fresh.
Really impressed with that, the Chardonnay too. Fantastic wine. Yeah, so good start. And let's just say to the audience, if you've got any questions, do put them in the Q&A. I'll monitor the Q&A. I can't monitor the chat at the same time, though. But I'll keep an eye on that. There's another question that's come in here that's quite interesting. Maybe we could do that before the next wine, which is from Charlotte Dean. She says, I sense you do not want your wines to be compared to Californian Pinot Noir, but do you look to Burgundy still for comparison? It's an interesting question, is it? Because obviously with Pinot, there's a big shadow of Burgundy. And it's like often people, is it a distraction to start thinking in terms of Burgundy when you make wine from the Mornington Peninsula?
When we started, that was definitely on the radar, trying to do something that would almost pit Burgundy. But I think you realise that Mornington's got its own character, and you've just got to make the wines to really enhance those characters. So Mornington's got its own personality.
Yeah. I think, Jamie, I think what we can say in terms of our relationship with Burgundy, obviously we love Burgundy wines, and we've got many good friends that we've made over the years in Burgundy. I think there's very much a shared philosophy. So I think there's a lot that you see in Burgundy that their philosophy that we ascribe to, and that is, trying to make wines that are really reflective of site, reflective of our sub-region or region, and taking a really I suppose, very sort of hands-off approach, wild yeast ferments and natural malolactic fermentations. Not everybody that follows all of that, but very similar sort of winemaking philosophy, I think, that drives what we do. You agree?
Yeah, but in terms of inspiration, I look at people like Lindsay, who's been in the region for, as one of the pioneers of the region. So, yes, you look at those wines and from Burgundy, you think how amazing they are. But you look at, I don't think Australian Pinot has ever been in a better place. And you probably would have seen that, Jamie, at the Massive in November. We're always striving for better, and it's continual improvement, and we're tireless on that front. But I'm one of the more younger winemakers in the region, and I'm just fortunate to stand on the shoulders of giants sometimes.
Yeah, this is a really good point, because the Pinot Massive, it's just to explain for people, this is a sort of like an inside sort of meeting, and a sort of like behind closed doors meetings for winemakers making Pinot Noir in Australia, who get together and they bring wines, and there's a discussion. So you get put on tables, and there's a table captain, and you taste the wines blind, everyone in the room, and then everyone critiques the wines. So it's winemakers critiquing their own wines, and sometimes it's problem wines that people have brought, sometimes it's really good wines or experimental wines they brought. And what I'd love is this just total atmosphere of forensic detail, looking at the wines, trying to kind of improve together in a collaborative way. And I was an outsider. I came in and I was allowed to sit in on this meeting, and I'm really interesting. But then what I noticed is when we had flights of Burgundy, red Burgundy, these forensic tasters who are so good at spotting minor problems in each other's wines suddenly gave the Burgundies a free pass. It's like, and some of the Burgundies weren't very good, and it's like there's things in those wines that if your neighbors were making those wines, you'd have words with them. Yeah, you'd say, guys, this is terrible. You need to sort this out. But it's like, so I suppose there is that sort of reverence for Burgundy. And obviously there's some great Burgundy, but there's some terrible Burgundy out there, and there's some spectacular bad value for money Burgundy out there as well. And I think it's really interesting that we can be thinking about Mornington Peninsula character Pinot as standing on its own feet as something that's aspirational, that these are special wines. And I love that there is this sort of characteristic that we, if we're tasting blind, we might a number of times out of 10 spot the Mornington wine because of these characteristics, which I think is really interesting. And I think you said Australian Pinot Noir has never been such a good place. And tasting around some of the examples in Yarra, Maston Rangers has got some absolutely stellar wines now. Not so many producers making stellar Pinot, but there's the ones that do are reaching very high heights. And Yarra's doing some great stuff. Mornington's doing great stuff, and Tasmania is really pressing forwards now. So it's like, I guess as you say, Martin, Burgundy is more of a way of thinking than a place in terms of inspiration. It's like this idea of going for elegance rather than power, trying to tease out the elements of a site so that you can you make a wine that is respects its place and shows its place. I think that's really interesting. Anyway, let's move on to the third wine. So, Peter, tell us about Handpicked.
Sure. So, Handpicked Wines as a business has been going for about 20 years. And in the early days, the owner, William Dong, was actually working, and he was inspired by a wine business called Lindemans in Australia, which in the early days of its business was trying to pick key varieties in key regions around Australia. So he went down a pathway of not being based in one region and really trying to pick and choose amazing and amazing varieties. So in those early days, he was doing collaborative projects with people, so Dominic Portet in the Yarra, Rolf Binder in Barossa, Fran Austin in Tasmania. And I think that began well, and he was probably happy with those initial stages. But I think the more he did that and the more he delved into it, he realised that he really needed to effectively get some skin in the game to really deep dive into specific sites to be able to evolve that story further. So if we fast forward to 2013, he acquired a vineyard here in Mornington called the Capella site, which is the vineyard that this particular wine comes from. And if we fast forward to now, we now don't do collaborative projects, but we have our own vineyards. So we have 8 vineyards spread across Australia through Yarra, Mornington, Tasmania, Barossa, along with a lot of growers that are spread as a myriad across different parts of Australia and New Zealand. For us as a producer, a big part of that step into site and the specifics of vineyard and trying to make wines that are singular and speak of the place that they come from, we in turn have then begun to think about what is the important thread that stitches that together. So as a part of that journey, we're now also accredited as organic across those vineyards and also accredited as sustainable. And I think that reflects for us the desire to really try to come back to that real authenticity in terms of that place, and what is driving wine quality is ultimately going to be the successful growth and health of those systems that are ultimately growing the grapes. And that actually also made us the first producer in Victoria to have both of those accreditations. In terms of this particular site, the Capella vineyard, that is home base for me, where I'm based at the winery there. And that is on the western port side of the peninsula. So it sits on that eastern side near the town of Bitton. And where we sit there is relatively low, so very much down the hill, so 25 metres of altitude, probably about 5 kilometres or so back from the ocean itself. So we very much have the cooling winds in the afternoon, but being down the hill, we also have that warmth. And the soils there are not a volcanic loam at all. They're a sandy loam, and that sees, if we do a soil pit, mix through the loam, you'll find the wind-blown sands that have blown back in from effectively the beach sand dunes, and even on occasion you'll find shells, things like that. And ultimately what this does is gives us Pinots that tend to have that darkness of fruit and that richness, which really is probably classic down the hill character. And probably also in speaking to this wine, I should touch on 2022, which we have alluded to a little bit earlier in our conversations, because 2022 was really in the thick of this La Nina weather system. So really, from a Mornington point of view, one of those really brutal spring periods saw the lead up to the grapes flowering that made this wine. And it probably was one of the all-time low-yielding vintages for the region on the back of that. So in that 2 tonne per hectare sort of average spectrum across the region. Similar to what Rollo was alluding to earlier, though, for 2022, having had this incredibly horrible flowering window, by the time we then got into the summer period through December into January, February, we actually then probably had a season which was much more what could be described as the Goldilocks weather sort of pattern. Not too cold, not too hot. And for me, the resulting wines, whilst we all would have loved a lot more of them, just have this wonderful purity and vibrancy and brightness to them. And I think that really builds upon what probably Mornington is classically known for, is this lovely purity of fruit with that lovely thread of acid driving through to the back palate, intermingled with the tannins that Tim referred to. So for me, I see all of those things coming together a bit in this wine. Ultimately, for the single vineyard wine that we have here, it's 2 blocks, 2/3 MV6 from one block, 1/3 Clone 115. MV6 a bit more powerful. That's completely destemmed. The 115 for our site just has this lovely perfume and fragrance, a bit more red fruited. So I do about 15% whole bunch in that parcel. So yeah, that sort of it works out differently in the final blend, but it gives us just that extra nuance of perfume and fragrance in the wine. Because it's the 1, a low yielding year, and 2, quite small blocks, it's about 1/3 new oak, and it's all in barrique for this particular wine. But in a general sense, I probably lean to puncheon, but not for this wine.
Beautiful wine, lovely. Everything's in perfect balance there, I think, and it's setting itself up for a nice evolution. So Crittenden, Rollo.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie.
And also, I noticed this is the only wine that's cork sealed, although it is a.
It is. It's under DM, so yes, it's just a bit of a traditional tilt that we've gone for, and we've had no problems with the DM. So we've decided to retain that seal method. So as mentioned earlier, I'm second generation. My parents established the vineyard and the business back in 1982. My dad had some friends at the time. His background was horticulture, and he had some friends that were importing wines and became very passionate about enjoying wines with his friends, and decided that he was going to combine his passions and wanted to plant a vineyard. And after a holiday down to Tasmania, I think he turned to my mum, it would have been in the late 70s or really early 80s, and said, I want to plant a vineyard and I want to do it in Tasmania. And I think Mum said, okay, well, be sure to stop in when you're coming back through and say hi to your family, because we're not moving to Tasmania. And so then you started to look around the backyard and realised that there were some plantings on the Mornington Peninsula, and started to catch up with Nat White and a couple of others down here who were already growing grapes, and decided that it was a region that he wanted to embrace. And so he did a lot of research at the time, a lot of soil tests, looked at a lot of climatic data, and settled on a site where we are today, which is we're at the foot of Red Hill on the northern side, over to the Port Phillip Bay side, which is on the western side of the Mornington Peninsula. And our soil profile is probably not dissimilar to Handpicked in that we have a sandy loam base with over a grey clay. So a lot sort of, probably a little bit more draining or higher draining soils than up the hill. When my parents planted, they planted a mixture of Cabernet at the time, which has subsequently been grafted over to Pinot Noir, and a little bit of Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. And all of our subsequent plantings have been to Pinot. And as I mentioned before, we have 7 clones of Pinot here on our property. Some of them are single planted, and some of them are combined planted. So we actually harvest all of the clones individually. We ferment them separately, and we age them separately, and then we draw on those clones to make three different wines. So we have our Cangeron Pinot, our Zama Pinot, and the Cri de Coeur Pinot, which you have today, which is the 2022 vintage as well. So same as Pete's. So in terms of, I guess, our viticultural process, we did farm conventionally for the first 25 years of the vineyard after its planting in the early 80s. And by conventional, I really mean that if there was a problem, there was usually a chemical that you would turn to try and fix it. So we used glyphosate to control weeds, and obviously any sort of fungicide available to control any disease pressures. And while we thought that seemed to be effective, that really at the time was perhaps not doing the best by the vineyard, and really more importantly, it wasn't doing any favours to the soil. We were just gradually killing out our organic matter in our soil by prolonged chemical use. So around about nearly 20 years ago now, we realised that we had a problem, and we decided to resurrect our soils over a gradual process. And that involved elimination of synthetic chemicals, but also reinvestment in the soil by composting and interrow cropping. We found over the subsequent sort of 15, 20 years that we've just seen this gradual return to natural vine health, natural disease resistance, and certainly from our perspective, a huge turnaround in the quality of the fruit and the result of wines that we're producing. And, you know, as any good winemaker will tell you, and viticulturalist for that matter, the more we do in the vineyard and the harder we work in the vineyard, the less we tend to work in the winery. So the fruit for this particular wine, of course, after hand harvesting, was brought into the winery. It was fermented in tiny ferments, 500 litre puncheons that have the heads knocked out, with varying degrees of whole bunch. So the end blend ended up probably being about 45% whole bunch, but very minimal maceration. We tend to just let the ferments do their own thing. I don't like the character of whole bunch in itself. I don't like to see that sort of stalky, stemmy character. So certainly you need to make sure you have high quality fruit with lignified stems and a good level of ripeness. But I find that excessive maceration with that whole cluster can really sort of leach out some of those greener tannins, which I don't find particularly attractive. So very little maceration. And then after maybe sort of 20 days on skins, they were pressed and individually barreled, and then pulled back together as a blend to complete the wine. So yeah, it's really, you know, without wanting to say I'm cliche, very much a focus on vine age, vine health, soil health, combining, and really pulling together that regionality as well. And it's interesting, I haven't had the chance to taste many of the Pinots yet tonight, but certainly very familiar with them over the years. And I would like to think that our Pinot sort of is unique to the site, but certainly has that lovely elegance that you see on the Mornington Peninsula as well.
It has a beautiful structure as well, this wine. It's not a harsh structure, but it's like it's present. You know, the structure's present and everything's held in this lovely tension. I think it's a beautiful wine. So, Lindsay, been waiting for a long time. Paringa.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm interested in the stories that we're hearing, because we've all got our individual family stories and business stories to tell. And I think in the wine industry, that's a critical thing that we all have to take ownership of. So Paringa, yes, I've come from a hard day picking and working in the winery. This is our 38th vintage, and similar to Crittenden, you know, I'm more in Gary's vintage, or Gary's a little older than I, but my son Jamie is now running the winery, and he's taken charge in the last 7 years or so, and I tend to look after the wine growing side and the quality from that end. So we started in the mid-80s. Planted a small site in Red Hill, so we're sort of midway in height. I think we're roughly 150 metres above sea level, which puts us up in the red. I classify it as the Red Hill sub-region. We're on the red volcanic soil, and I planted Pinot Chardonnay and Shiraz originally. The clones that we planted were the Davis clones that were available in the 80s, plus MV6. In more recent time, we've acquired a number of vineyards. We've got 8 vineyards in the Red Hill region now, all fairly close to where we are, all on similar soils, although you look even within one property, you'll get a variation in even the red soils from across the block. We planted an 8-acre vineyard last year, and the difference in the soils from one side of that 8-acre block to the other is staggering, really. And from a sort of a lighter, loamy soil to a sort of a dark burgundy red colour on the other side. So that's just the geography and the evolution of the land that has actually formed that. So Paringa, yes, we're one of the earlier producers. Across those 8 vineyards, we have roughly 40 different blocks of Pinot. So when we come to do our assessment of the wines prior to sort of assembling our single vineyard, our estate wine, which is what we have in front of us here, and our Peninsula, which is our entry level, we're assessing 40 different blocks of Pinot. And those 40 blocks are clonally different and site different. So we get a huge variation in styles of Pinot that we're able to work with to blend into what we're looking for. Off our home property, we have our single vineyard Pinot that we've been making since 2000. Shortly after that, we started our estate, which is this wine in front of us here. And this mostly comes from a vineyard we have in Cullen's Road that was planted back in the 80s, about the same time as when Paringa was formed. It was owned by Tux Ridge, and there is a number of different clones there, MV6 being the dominant one. And we just love the wine that comes off that property. And so it's the main component that's in this wine in front of us. We ferment our single vineyard wines in foudres. We've got wooden foudres in the winery, and for the majority of the wines we ferment in stainless steel small pots that hold about 2 tonne. So it's very small, hands-on, artisanal winemaking, so I say. So this particular wine, this is from 22, which the vintage has been talked about around the table here. We had, with the La Nina system, we had horrendous winds in November when our vines were flowering across this region, and it simply blew the pollen away. And so the yields were very small, very low, chicken berries rather than fully formed berries, so they had 1 pip or none, and so the bunches were minuscule. They would sit in the palm of your hand, and but out of that came incredible concentration and quality. And so, as has been mentioned around the table, we lament the low yield, but we celebrate the quality. And in this particular, and might I just digress a slight for a second, we thought the quality of this vintage was so good that we've released a new single vineyard wine just from this vintage, and we haven't made another one since. Maybe we might this year, but so it's a $250 bottle of Pinot from Mornington Peninsula, which is pushing the boundaries, and I think we deserve recognition of really what we're achieving down here. Back to this wine. So this is 2022 estate, mostly from Cullen's Road. It's has about 15% whole bunch. So my son has, well, I think I've twisted his arm rather than him twist mine. But so I used whole bunch back in the 90s and 80s, and just put around 15% of whole bunch in the bottom of every fermenter, and that's what we did. And 1999 was a particular cool vintage, and there was quite a bit of criticism of Paringa wines maybe, but Mornington wines in general, I think that they had a greenness to them, and the finger was pointed at whole bunch, and so I decided, okay, I wasn't going to use whole bunch ever again. And it's taken 20 years to sort of reverse that decision. So I'm not sure what that tells about.
Are you back to 15 now?
We don't. We're making it differently now. We go the 100% whole bunch in fermenters, and then when we're working out our blends, we'll work out whether it needs to be 5%, 10%, 15. And in 22, we went with 15. We could have even gone 20 because of the depth and power of the wine, I think. But whereas in 23, we backed off a lot, and so I think we're only 5%. So I think doing it that way gives you the flexibility of adding the amount of whole bunch that you think suits the wine. That's about it, Jamie.
That's great. Fantastic wine. 5 beautiful wines so far. What about the 6th? Martin, 10 minutes by tractor.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie, and hi, everybody. The story of 10 minutes by tractor, it starts back in the early 90s with 3 families planting vineyards up in Main Ridge, which is one of the highest and coolest parts of the peninsula, right next to Red Hill. It's on the red volcanic soils, and the 3 families didn't know each other, but they used the same advisor, the same viticulturalist, the same contractor to plant their vineyards, and unsurprisingly, they ended up with not only the same sort of varietal mix with Pinot and Chardonnay, a little bit of Pinot Gris, but also the same clones and the same trellising, etc. They got together and sort of formed a little mini co-op and sort of to try and combine resources and share knowledge, and that was the formation of 10 Minutes by Tractor, which came from the observation, of course, that those vineyards were all just 10 minutes by tractor apart. I suppose that's sort of where I came in after 2 years of looking around Australia and looking in Yarra Valley and around Victoria, Macedon, and down in Tasmania. And I was just fortunate to be here at a time when those 3 families were looking for someone to take it over. So that was 21 years ago, and from that we've now got 10 vineyards across the peninsula, both up the hill and in Main Ridge, and also down in the lower parts of the peninsula where we grow grapes. And our philosophy, I think we've already really covered the sort of philosophy we have, which is about giving that sort of really giving the best expression we can to each site, and that's ultimately expressed in our single vineyard wines. And fascinating to look at those 3 original vineyards, of course, still today, and look at them and just see just how incredibly different they are, notwithstanding the fact that they were planted at the same time by the same people, been managed the same way for 30 odd years, and the same clones. So that's part of why we're all here, because of that love of this incredible variances we get in the style of Pinot, and as we've already covered, this incredible difference between up and down the hill. So in 2021, I suppose I'll just tell you a little bit about that first. I mean, I chose 21 because I thought it'd be another one. It's another one of these sort of 3 really interesting vintages that sit sort of between 2020 and 24, 25. It was a La Nina affected year. It was the 2020 was almost a wipeout on the higher parts of the peninsula. 2021 wasn't affected as much, but still low yielding, and it was quite wet. We had and cool, so it was a very cool year. Not dissimilar in some respects to 23. We actually had quite a bit of rain in January and also in March, but we also had some beautiful weather in the middle in February. So it really, you're getting between sort of 23, 22 and 21, a bit of an idea of that sort of vintage overlay. With this wine, we're looking at our estate level wine, which is sits in the middle of our range, and it basically we're really trying to give the best expression we can for the peninsula. It's effectively a reserve level wine, sits between our 10X and our single vineyard wines. And we obviously draw that, look at all the different parcels, as Lindsay was saying. We have 40 odd, I never counted them, but there'd be 40 odd different sort of parcels of Pinot that we pick from the different vineyards and that we bring together at the end of the year. In 2017, I decided to make life a little bit harder for us, and maybe for those that sell our wine, by taking our estate wine and actually creating 2 wines out of that, because we see this incredible difference stylistically in fruit between up in the high parts of the peninsula and down in the lower parts. So we created the up the hill and down the hill Pinot, made the same way, but sourced obviously from the higher vineyards and the lower vineyards. And I think it's that sort of a fascinating sort of sub-regional exercise where you can really see stylistically those differences. Down the hill, obviously bigger, maybe more plush fruit, a little bit more sort of power and more tannin, whereas up the hill, that more ethereal sort of style, a lot more spice, and almost autumnal characters which come through in the wines. And I love the 21s because the 21s really, I think, were very, in a way, very transparent, sort of showed a lot of detail in the wines. This is certainly very different to, say, the 22s, which we had that much more plush fruit, and you see that in the 22s, which we see here. But this wine's made from a combination of the McCall vineyard, which is one of the original 3 vineyards, a little bit of our high density vineyard, which I alluded to earlier, has a little bit of the Calera fruit in there as well, and also the Wallace and Judd vineyard. So it really is sort of giving you, we're trying to give sort of the best expression we can to that sort of main ridge up the hill character. And so there's all those descriptors we think about with this, which is that sort of 5 spice, the potpourri, autumnal characters, very sort of brackeny and very sort of savoury, and a very different end of the spectrum to some of the other wines that we make from other sites. But the McCall vineyard in particular, I think, has a pretty dominant role here, and I think that sort of that character that I associate very much with the main ridge is really reflected well with McCall, with that spice, as I said, and just that sort of, as I said, a more ethereal sort of style.
Beautiful wine. And I must say, 6 really fantastic wines, and we've kind of run toward the end of our time now. So I know there's some questions that were answered in the Q&A, so I apologize for that. But I feel in the interests of everyone who's joined in, I think it's a time we should wrap this up. So I just want to thank you all for presenting your wine so beautifully and talking about your region so well. I think it's a really lovely tasting. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Cheers.
No worries.